Welcome to The Origin of Things, or TOOT for short. A short format podcast where I give you the origins, the backstories, slightly dramatized but 100% true, of things that you know, love, and use. I reveal what I'm talking about only at the very end, keeping you, the listener, guessing. Or so I hope. In previous seasons, I've taken you through the stories that have led to some of your favorite brands and the unlikely stories and accidents that got us there. If there's a lesson from this podcast, let it be that great things can come from the most unexpected of places and sometimes even mistakes. I am your host, Deepak Gopalakrishnan, or as the world calls me, Chuck. The origins of that for another day. In this season, we're going to do something slightly different. Let's get cracking. For a young musician, there are many dreams of becoming famous, of communicating what they stand for, of becoming great at their craft, of influencing a genre, of playing to a large audience, of playing to celebrities. What if something a musician does inspires another musician, helping him find his feet and write one of the greatest songs ever? Meet Alan. In the late 80s, Alan taught French at the Windlesham House School, a boarding school in Sussex. He also knew a fair bit of guitar, did Alan, and although this genial, slightly overweight Englishman with a strong aftershave probably didn't know it at the time, he was in a way responsible for one of the greatest rock songs of all time. Let's back up a little. Let's go back 10 years to the late 1970s. This was a time when Alan was not a French teacher, but a musician. Or, well, he had a day job and he was moonlighting as a musician. A semi-professional musician. He and a few friends had a small band and they would play some R&B, some jazz standards, just a bunch of friends who looked like they were having fun. The band wasn't famous, but they did manage to make some money through their gigs. Just regular folks, they had an unpretentious style of playing and presentation, so to compensate, they would give their band a rotating cast of fancy nicknames as they introduced themselves. These nicknames were often in stark contrast to their actual personas, which just added to the charm. Now, the band played in some nice venues and some downbeat ones as well. Among the latter comes the most important gig they would ever play. Not because a massive audience came out and their careers changed, quite the contrary. On one fateful evening, in a quiet part of Deptford in London, in a small pub, Alan and his friends were playing some jazz standards to a scanty audience in their own unpretentious way. A scanty audience, most of whom might have just come in to avoid the rain that had just started outside. And the audience also consisted of some drunk youth who didn't care much for this kind of music with trumpets and stuff. "Give us some rock and roll," they said. In this audience was another musician, a young musician, trying to make it big, a musician with a unique style, shall we say an unpretentious style, in an unpretentious pub south of the Thames River, watching an unpretentious band made of unpretentious musicians, playing unpretentious jazz and blues, but with a pretentious name, a deliberately pretentious name. And this caught the fancy of the young musician in attendance. The son of a Hungarian Jew who fled the Nazis, he was keen on making a career as a rock musician, but he was nothing like his contemporaries. He wasn't flashy, he didn't have much stage presence, and his music really didn't sound like what was running up the charts. Possibly while looking to clear his head, he went to that pub near where he was staying and happened to see Alan's band. Alan's band inspired our young musician in two ways. One, their unpretentious style told him that he, a young balding Geordie who nobody might accuse of glamour, could afford to be a rock musician and be unpretentious while doing it. And two, Alan's band signed off with a grand nickname that gave our musician the subject matter for his song. A song that would go on to define his band and would, to this day, remain their greatest hit. Now, I'd like to pause here and take a small detour and talk about how awesome the internet can be sometimes. Sure, there's a lot of hate and misinformation, but at its best, it can connect strangers from around the world and bring together stories. One such thing like that happened to me. Yes, me, your humble host. You see, when I was working on this very episode, the one that you're listening to right now, I was aware of some parts of the story, but I wanted more. I wanted more detail. Did anyone know anything more about Alan's band? I had almost given up hope until I decided to read YouTube comments. Generally a practice that therapists might recommend staying away from, it actually proved useful while researching origins of classic rock songs. It was in the comments section of one such video speculating the origins of this very song that a man called James had left a comment saying, "Ha, I actually knew Alan. He was my French teacher at Windlesham House School. When he found out I was playing the guitar and this song in particular, he showed me the chords for the song and he said that he was actually a member of the band that inspired the musician to come up with it in the first place." By his own admission, James, the person who left that comment, said that it's a small story but one that he would keep telling anyone who'd bother to listen. Well, you know who bothered to listen? Your humble podcast host, of course. I got in touch with James, swapped email IDs and asked him anything he could tell me about Alan at all. James was nice enough to help out and sent me, a complete stranger at the other side of the world, a long email with a lot of the color and even theories that you have just heard in this episode. Out of respect for privacy, I have changed Alan's actual name. So let's recap here, shall we? Alan, name change of course, was part of a small, unpretentious band that played friendly jazz blues music in the late 1970s, played in a small pub in London to a small audience and signed off calling themselves something fancy. This inspired another up-and-coming young musician who wrote a song about their experience, which ended up being a massive, massive hit, so much so that a young James, my correspondee, tried learning the song on a guitar a decade later in the same school where Alan was now teaching French. Alan, who a decade earlier played their most fateful gig to an audience of just a few people who were coming in out of the rain just as the jazz go down. A pub that had a crowd of young boys fooling around in the corner who gave no damns about that trumpet-playing band. But among those that did give a damn was a young musician called Mark Knopfler, who had just started a band called the Dire Straits. Seeking an idea, he would find it, as the lead vocalist of Alan's band would announce just as they ended their show and the time bell was rung, "Good night, now it's time to go home. We'll just say one last thing. We are the Sultans of Swing." See you next week with another episode of The Origin of Things. And special thanks to James Bell for helping with this episode. Say thanks to him on Twitter. His handle is in the description of this episode. If you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us and all our shows on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcast.com. You can also follow us on social media. We are at IVM Podcast on Twitter and Instagram. If you want to reach out to me, that's Chuck_Gopal on Twitter and Chuck of All Trades on Instagram. All links in the show notes of this episode. See you next week.